This video is sponsored by the Friendly Fire Team. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're doing another Getting Started in Warhammer 40k video, this time talking about Death Guard. The Death Guard were originally the 14th Legion of the Emperor's Space Marines. However, during the Horus Heresy, they fell to the Dark God Nurgle, trading their superhuman speed granted by the Space Marine transformation process for the virulent poxes of the God of Disease, granting them long life and physical resilience, which they used to spread the contagions of their new Chaos Patron throughout the realms of the Imperium. On the tabletop, Death Guard embody a philosophy of implacable momentum. Their armies are not typically fast, but universally boast above-average defensive stat lines, poisoned weapons that provide widespread access to the lethal hits ability that allow even paltry Death Guard small arms to pose danger to any opponent on the battlefield by inflicting automatic wounds on critical hit rolls, as well as just some of the highest damage output in all of Warhammer 40k. This close-range output is fostered by their army ability, Nurgle's Gift. This allows the army to apply the afflicted condition to enemies in an aura around them, covering an ever-growing area of pestilence, and giving enemies -1 toughness, stacked with an alternative effect based on the particular disease that the army chooses to infect itself with at the start of the battle. This grants the Death Guard player the choice between one of three contagions: the Skull Squirm Blight, that subtracts 1 from enemy hit rolls while they are within that contingent range or otherwise afflicted by a contagion; Rattle Joint Ague, which worsens the save characteristic of models in that unit, essentially granting a +1 AP bonus to everything in the Death Guard army; and Scabrous Soul Rot, which reduces the move, leadership, and objective control characteristics of models nearby them by 1, allowing them to more easily take objectives or make it more difficult for enemies to escape them. Now, the decision of which contagion the Death Guard player chooses to infect their opponent with at the start of the game is very important. Enemies that are focused on melee attacks and don't boast particularly strong armor are especially impacted by Skull Squirm Blight, giving them -1 to hit. On the flip side, enemies with high save characteristics or ones that don't necessarily want to engage you in melee will be laid low by the Rattle Joint Ague. Lastly, Scabrous Soul Rot is good against enemies that are attempting to take control of your objectives with masses of Horde unit, who are focused more on controlling objectives rather than killing the Death Guard army. As you gain experience with the Death Guard army, you will identify particular situations in which to choose each one of these contagions. Generally speaking, if you are just getting started, I would consider the difference between Skull Squirm Blight and Rattle Joint Ague in particular. If you are playing against an army that has a majority save characteristic of a 3+, or has a lot of high save models that are going to be up in your face that will be affected by that contagion, I would choose Rattle Joint Ague. Skull Squirm Blight is good if your opponent doesn't have those particular defensive characteristics, and I would save Scabrous Soul Rot for very specific situations. If you're just getting started, I wouldn't really pay attention to that one so much, but there are going to be some situations you'll find where it will be useful as you gain more experience. Now, in this army, as I do with all of these Getting Started videos, I'm going to be running you through the Death Guard faction and telling you how to build up a Death Guard army from a combat patrol through incursion gameplay, as well as up to Strike Force games. As always with this series, we're going to be going through some tactical analysis of each of these lists, as well as some list building tenets. However, if you in particular want to start your Death Guard army in a different way, that is totally up to you. My hope is just going to give you some advice to get started with. Now, with that, I want to start by talking about the Death Guard Combat Patrol. Now, as always with these series, if you are new to 40k or new to this faction in particular, I always recommend that you get started with a Combat Patrol. These present a very good opportunity to jump into the faction with pre-built lists that you can play against other combat patrols in their own format, so you can learn the core mechanics and you can learn the basic variations of the army abilities. Now, this combat patrol in particular is good as well because it does represent a very strong jumping off point for the faction. Basically, every single unit in this army is going to see play in other detachments, and to be honest, the majority of these units are going to see play in basically every single list that you will build in Death Guard moving on into the future, so this is an excellent place to start. Now, this combat patrol includes a Lord of Virulence. This is a Terminator character who can buff your ranged attacks. He both gives his own unit rerolls to wound with ranged attacks, but he can also grant rerolls to hit for other units in your army that are targeting enemies he can see. This requires that you play your Lord of Virulence kind of aggressively, but if you do so, you get the payoff of your whole army being more effective against the things that he is targeting. Now, from there, we also have a Tallyman. This guy is a little bit more of a support character. He generates you command points passively over the course of the game. That's phenomenal. He doesn't have to do anything, and oftentimes what you will see is players will just keep this guy on your back objective. He will write in his little scroll and generate you command points and hold that objective for the entire game. He's not a very exciting character, but he is incredibly useful and extremely inexpensive. From there, we have a unit of Death Shroud Terminators. These are going to be a mainstay melee unit for the faction as we move on to start talking about the list construction. They're relatively resilient with a high wounds count, high toughness. They also hit like an absolute truck in melee, especially once they are attached with characters, and they can enable that melee by teleporting with deep strike close to enemies that are afflicted. All this requires that you do is get a unit like our Rhino here, for example, into range in order to project the affliction aura onto an enemy unit to then allow these Terminators to jump close to that unit and then charge them with a 6-inch charge coming out of reserve. So you could, for example, advance the Rhino up the battlefield, maybe even disembark Plague Marines and move the Plague Marines up into range of that unit to get it contagioned. Then the Terminators can deep strike closer than normal and make a very easy charge out of reserve. These guys are incredibly powerful for that reason. Now, last but certainly not least, we do have 7 Plague Marines. That's a little bit of a weird number. There's a kind of a meme for Death Guard that their Plague Marine units always come in 7s because that's Nurgle's favorite number. It does make it a little bit difficult to build an army of Plague Marines, however, because you buy them in a weird odd number and may have some left over, but that's okay just as we're playing in a smaller format right now. These guys are great because of their opportunity to mount special weapons. They can equip special weapons on essentially every single model in the unit, making those individual models either great in melee with heavy plague weapons or good at shooting with things like plasma guns or plague spewers. Once we start attaching characters to these guys, you're going to see that the damage output from this unit is astronomical, both in ranged and in melee. Our great-grandfather Nurgle is a pretty friendly guy. All he wants to do is spread the love and affection of his pestilent contagions throughout the world, which is why it's a good thing that this video is sponsored by the Friendly Fire team. Friendly Fire is a group of Israel-based Warhammer enthusiasts who like Warhammer and all other miniature games. While they got their start with running in-person events, they have slowly grown to infect the global wargaming space with more international events being held on Tabletop Simulator. There's a link in the video description for you to join them on their Discord server, where they are running pickup games and monthly Tabletop Simulator leagues for a variety of miniature games, including Warhammer 40,000, Age of Sigmar, Bible Crisis Protocol, Trench Crusade, and many more. Whether you're a hardcore tournament grinder trying to improve your game, or just looking to hang out and throw some dice, the Friendly Fire server has like-minded people for you to get games with. As they expand their event roster, they're going to incorporate things like regular online tournaments and even organize travel to large international events like the WTC. So join them down in the link in the video description to find practice games or just a place to chat at 3 a.m. to theory craft your disgusting Death Guard lists. So jump into the server and join a community that plays hard, memes harder, and always rolls ones. Because remember, in this case, Friendly Fire actually is friendly. Now, with that, we're going to move over to an Incursion list build. In the Incursion game mode, this is 1,000 points, and we're going to be adding about 400 points to our combat patrol to build out to this level, but we have to use all of the normal 40k list construction rules, which means we have to choose a detachment. Now, if you are just getting started with the faction, I recommend that you start with the Champions of Contagion detachment. This detachment is focused on buffing your Death Guard units that have attached characters within them, which, given how efficient and effective Death Guard characters are, should be most of your infantry units. I also recommend this detachment specifically for new players because it's very flexible and it's extremely straightforward. And the units that are good in it can be transitioned to basically any other detachment in the army, all the while its abilities and its stratagems are very simple to learn and to use. The detachment ability allows you to choose a new contagion of Nurgle for your army at the start of each battle round, rather than being locked into one at the start of the game. This allows you you more flexibility to learn the optimal contagions for each situation. And if you choose wrong, you can just swap to a new one later on during the game, or even swap between those contagions based on the tactical situation. If you want to steal an enemy objective and mess with their secondary gameplay, you can turn on Scabrous Soul Rot to reduce their movement and objective control, so it's more difficult for them to take objectives or more difficult for them to move up to them. If you are out of range to contagion enemies at the start of your turn, but you're expecting to receive a melee charge, you can turn on Skull Squirm Blight to mitigate the power of that charge. Then, later on during the game, you can lock in Rattle Joint Ague to tank your opponent's armor save for the follow-up counterattack. Just keep in mind that this decision must be made at the start of the round, so it will occur before the first player takes any actions or draws any objective cards each round. There is a little bit of a downside to this ability if you are going second, since you will have to choose your Contagion of Nurgle at the start of your opponent's turn, which means that you might not know the tactical situation when it comes back to your turn. However, you can choose a objective that will screw them over the most at the beginning of their turn. So you win some, you lose some to some extent. Now, there are 4 incredibly powerful stratagems in this detachment. The first one is Blessings of Filth. It simply gives your units critical hits on unmodified hit rolls of a 5+. Now, critical hits are an important mechanic for Death Guard because many of their units have a critical hit effect. Basically, 90% of weapons in the faction have the lethal hits ability. This means that on a critical hit, the wound roll is automatic. You don't have to make a wound roll for that attack. It simply goes directly to forcing your opponent to make a save. You skip that whole wound roll section. Many of your units will also have effects like sustained hits, which gives you additional hits if you roll a critical hit, and Blessings of Filth will buff all of those. So as we move on through the discussion, keep in mind that any critical hit effect in this detachment for 1 command point can have its effect doubled, essentially. You're twice as likely to roll a critical hit than you would be if you were just critical hitting on 6s once you're buffed by this ability. And some of these units will have the ability to critical hit on enhanced rolls built into their datasheets. We'll talk about those as we get to them. The other one is Grotesque Fortitude. This gives you +2 toughness characteristic. You use it in response to enemy attacks, and it's a very strong defensive stratagem, especially for units like your Deathshroud Terminators, who are a high base toughness characteristic. You can mess with a lot of your opponent's combat math. The most important thing to consider is your opponent's strength when you use this stratagem, because it's not a built-in -1 to wound effect, for example. It does rely on the comparison between your toughness characteristic and the strength characteristic of the attacking unit. So, for example, a strength 8 weapon normally wounds a Deathshroud Terminator who is toughness 7 on 3s, because the strength characteristic is higher than the toughness characteristic. If you use Grotesque Fortitude, that 3+ goes to a 5+, because now your toughness is 9, which is higher than the strength characteristic, which means that the attack wounds on a 5 rather than a 3 or better. However, if we consider that, for example, a strength 9 attack was targeting our Plague Marines, Grotesque Fortitude would have no effect. A strength 9 attack versus the Plague Marines' toughness of 6 already wounds them on 3s. Once you push that toughness up to 8, you're still wounding on 3s, so there's not really a change there. So keep in mind the strength characteristic of these attacks when you're choosing to use Grotesque Fortitude, but in the situations where you can especially affect things like strength 8 weapons or strength 7 weapons when targeting your infantry, those will always be very impactful. Now, the next one is Malignant Magnified. This, if you target a unit that is below its starting strength, meaning that if it's a multi-model unit, it's lost 1 or more models, or if it's a single model unit, like a vehicle, it has lost at least 1 wound. It gives you full hit and wound rerolls. Now, there are other ways to gain rerolls in this army, but the effect is enormous. It is expensive. It's a 2 command point stratagem, which it tends to be pretty expensive in 40k. We will be running a Tallyman in this list, however, so we have some command point generation elsewhere. But the thing to keep in mind is that your target has to be wounded for this to work. Most of your units are good, or I would say mediocre, both in shooting and in melee, which means oftentimes you can plink them for a couple wounds with something like Death Shroud Terminators, which have a pistol torrent weapon. If you're able to do any amount of damage, once you get into melee with that unit, you can then use this stratagem to get full rerolls. And as we're talking about an army that has critical hits and especially enhanced critical hits, getting hit rerolls allows you to trigger those critical hits for things like lethal hits that much more often, which makes this a very powerful stratagem in combination with most of your offensive profiles. Now, lastly is Rabid Infusion. This allows your army to gain fight first if you have 2 attached character models. As we move on, we'll find out that our Plague Marines will actually be able to attach multiple characters. If your opponent attacks them while they have those 2 characters, for 1 command point, it can give you fight first. You must use it at the start of the fight phase, which essentially means that if it's your opponent's turn, that Plague Marine unit will fight before any unit that charged them, even if the other unit has fights first. I have a whole video separately talking about how fights first works, so if you have any questions, I would refer to that one. But essentially, this will mean that if you've moved up to attack your opponent, they will then attack you back. You can use this stratagem to fight first in the fight phase and kill them before they swing into you. So that's another very powerful defensive stratagem. Now, the other stratagems in the detachment are a little confusing. I would mostly ignore them for your first couple games until you find situations in which to use them. They kind of rely on very specific list builds to be relevant. Now, when we're moving this combat patrol into a Champions of Contagion incursion game, I recommend that we focus very heavily on these infantry units. The whole detachment is focused on infantry models and especially units with attached characters within them, so that's what we're going to be trying to push with this army composition. Now, to be fair, these units are basically good in any detachment, especially things like Plague Marines and Death Shroud Terminators, so building an army this way you will not find is forcing you to take units that you wouldn't normally want to take anyway. Now, first of all, I've added 3 additional Death Shroud Terminators to the army. As I mentioned before, these guys hit like an absolute truck in melee, and they can deliver themselves into melee because they can deep strike closer than normal to afflicted enemies. And what we've done is actually added a second character to lead them. Death Shroud Terminators do appreciate being led by characters because they can protect the characters. They are bodyguards in the lore, after all. We have 1 unit that we can attach our Lord of Virulence into. That allows the Lord of Virulence to play a little bit more aggressively than normal, or even deep strike with those Death Shroud Terminators close to enemies to then provide his rerolls targeting enemies that he can see. Our Plague Marines are going to benefit from that quite a bit, so that's going to be nice to have if he can get up into an aggressive position. And then you have a lot of good anti-infantry shooting from the combination of the Death Shroud Terminators plus the Lord of Virulence's Plague Spewer. He also grants them wound rerolls as well, so they're also going to be more effective when shooting. Now, the other character that we've added is a Lord of Contagion. These guys are absolutely incredible, and they're going to be one of the melee powerhouses of our faction. They have a very strong offensive melee profile. They can also respawn themselves when they die. So even if our opponent comes in to kill them in the fight phase, there's a potential that the Lord of Contagion flips over and then at the end of that phase respawns back to life and then can charge them and attack them again, which is an enormous amount of value from this guy. He also grants one of the strongest melee buffs to his unit. He gives them +1 to wound on the charge as well as sustained hits. Now, all of the melee profiles that the Death Shroud Terminators have lethal hits as well, so we can use this combination alongside our stratagem to gain enhanced critical hits, Blessings of Filth, to give these guys 5-up critical hits, which will score you both a lethal hit and a sustained hit. If you've charged that turn, that sustained hit will also be at +1 to wound. So the amount of additional damage that this guy can coax out of this unit is absolutely insane. We're definitely going to be playing more of these guys as we move on to larger game sizes. Now, on top of that, we've also added a pair of characters to the Plague Marine squad. First off is the Biologist Putrefier. This guy has another very powerful leadership effect. First of all, he can shoot pretty well. He throws a Hyper Blight Grenade that can do kind of a lot of damage. But on top of that, he also grants all weapons in your unit lethal hits. While many weapons in a Plague Marine squad have lethal hits built in, not all of them do. And the Plague Marines, as I mentioned before, can equip tons of special weapons. I almost always recommend that you take the allowed allotment of Blight Launchers as well as either Plasma or Melta Guns. Your Plague Champion can take a Plasma Gun, and you can also have a Plasma Gunner or a Melta Gunner elsewhere in the unit. Those special weapons will be granted lethal hits thanks to the Biologist Putrefier, and then he's also shooting as well, and on top of that, he also grants that 5+ critical hit effect on top of that. So he gives all your weapons lethal hits, so automatic wounds on critical hits, and then he doubles the effectiveness of your critical hits. Now, we can stack that with the Malignant Plaguecaster. If you target an afflicted enemy, which 90% of the time you will be doing regardless, because you're going to be up close and personal, either in melee with them or being delivered by the Rhino close enough to get into that position, he grants you sustained hits. Exactly like we just talked about with the Lord of Contagion, the unit is going to be critical hitting on 5-ups thanks to the attachment of the Biologus Putrefier, which means that these two characters together can combine their powers and grant you sustained hits, so additional hits on critical hits, as well as lethal hits, so automatic wound on critical hits. So each 5 or higher that you roll when you're targeting an enemy that is being afflicted by your Contagions of Nurgle, then you are getting 1 automatic wound and 1 hit that you'll then move to roll a wound roll on. The sustained hits, unfortunately, don't get the effect of lethal hits, so you have to roll to wound those ones as normal, and then that adds to whatever damage the unit's doing normally with their other hit rolls. So the combination of these two characters, in addition to the characters being kind of scary to attack with themselves, can essentially double the effectiveness of this Plague Marine squad. Now, once the Plague Marine squad is embarked into the Rhino has an ability called Fire Support, which is going to give them wound rerolls if they target something that the Rhino has targeted. Now, Chaos Rhinos are a little bit funny. They might look like they're kind of unassuming, but they actually get 2 pintle-mounted Stormbolters, 1 on each cupola, which means that within 12 inches of an opponent, they're actually shooting 8 times. The Death Guard Rhino has lethal hits as well. So those attacks are actually not terrible. On top of that, they also get a blast weapon, a Havoc Launcher, so these little rhinos actually attack potentially upwards of 14 times, depending on how large your target is. So if you're checking a large infantry unit, for example, you may be getting bonus attacks on that blast weapon. And those hits are lethal, plus they're also being affected by your Contagions of Nurgle. If you are afflicting the enemy, then they're going to have a lower toughness and potentially even a lower save characteristic. So these attacks are actually very relevant. If you point even one of these guns at a target and hit it, he's then going to give the Plague Marine squad, if they disembarked from it that turn, wound rerolls. So any of those sustained hits that we rolled, thanks to the Malignant Plaguecaster, then have an enhanced chance to wound because of that Fire Support wound rerolls. So this little combination, this little package of a Rhino, these 2 little characters, as well as this 7 model Plague Marine squad, is a ridiculous amount of damage. And when we are combining that with these 2 pretty powerful melee units that can both grant the Plague Marines hit rerolls, thanks to the Lord of Virulence, as well as all of the melee bonuses that the Lord of Contagion can give to his unit, the potential damage that your army has is incredible. Now, in order to actually score on objectives, we have our Poxwalkers here. These guys are just good because they're relatively cheap objective holders. They can infiltrate, so they can deploy out in front of your army at the beginning of the game, and then they can wander around and score objectives and contest your opponent's objectives. They're not the most exciting unit ever, but they are good at scoring, which is all we need them for. Now, deploying this army and playing it on the battlefield is actually going to be relatively simple because most of it will begin the game off the table. The Death Shroud Terminators, I 99% of the time recommend that you start in Deep Strike. They can teleport onto the battlefield as the game goes on, and we can put up to 500 points of our army into Deep Strike. So Death Shroud Terminators will be most of your reserves allowance in most of your games. That will allow them to make use of their close Deep Strike if you're afflicting an enemy, or use the Rapid Ingress stratagem to bring them off out of Deep Strike during your opponent's turn, to then allow them to move and charge enemies. So they're very, very powerful for that reason. The combination of the Plague Marines, as well as their 2 characters, the Plaguecaster as well as the Biologus Putrefier, I recommend that you embark into the Rhino to make use of its fire support. Now, the Rhino, you can start in a relatively defensive position as long as you have the opportunity to push it towards the center of the battlefield. Especially at 1,000 points, it's a little difficult to both kill a Rhino if it's trying to stay alive, as well as all of the embarked occupants. So you can play this guy a little aggressively in order to hold down objectives. The Tallyman is going to be your backline objective holder. He can stand on the objective in the backline here, and he can just farm command points using his little scroll right there for the entire game. He's very easy to play, so he'll just sort of vibe down there. The Poxwalkers can be played in a couple different ways. I always recommend that, especially if you're new to the game, you start them in terrain that's up towards the center of the battlefield, but not necessarily too aggressively. Sometimes if your opponent has units like vehicles that are kind of hard to move, or many scouting units that really want to push out of your opponent's deployment zone, placing these guys 9 inches away from the opponent's deployment zone to restrict their movement can be useful. But I would say in 80% of the games, you would prefer that the Poxwalkers just remain alive for the first turn or so. So I would keep them out of line of sight of your opponent, outside your deployment zone, but in a position where they can walk onto early objectives and force your opponent to come deal with them, lest you hold down those objectives. Once those Poxwalkers are out there and committed, they can score some secondaries, they can threaten control of these objectives, and if your opponent pulls anything out to attack them, you can just run the Rhino into the center of the battlefield, disembark all your Plague Marines out of it, apply the fire support bonus, and then absolutely eviscerate whatever has moved into the center. If your opponent has any big, scary, tanky units that are going to be moving into the middle of the battlefield, that's exactly the target that the Plague Marines want to get, because then they're going to be getting all of the benefits of their the wombo combo. Now, the turn that the Plague Marines are disembarking from the Rhino to attack, if you have a good opportunity to disembark the Lord of Virulence at the same time, I would recommend that you do that. The Lord of Virulence, as I mentioned before, if your opponent is in your Contagion aura, so if they're in the center of the battlefield, for example, and your Rhino has moved to be within 6 or 9 inches, depending on what battle round it is, and depending on how large your Contagion auras are, then they can deploy 6 inches away from them. If the Lord of Virulence can see what the Plague Marines want to be shooting at, he can grant them hit rerolls, either hit rerolls of 1 or full hit rerolls if they're firing with a blast weapon. For example, the Blight Launcher in the Plague Marine squad. He grants his unit wound rerolls in shooting as well, so his unit can fire and potentially kill an infantry unit before charging into something that they actually want to attack. So the turn where your Plague Marines all want to jump out and attack, I would recommend that the Lord of Virulence hops out as well. So that can be kind of like a 1-2 punch and a bit of a threat overload for your opponent, where they now have to deal with this Plague Marine squad, which can potentially fight first if they charge it, so they have to deal with that in shooting, and then also this resilient Death Shroud Terminator unit that can use your +2 toughness strat to keep itself alive in your opponent's response turn when they come back to attack you. Now, from there, we also have the Lord of Contagion unit, which, if you have the opportunity to afflict an enemy and you can deep strike close to them and make an easy charge out of deep strike, I should mention that when the Death Shroud Terminators come in out of deep strike near an afflicted enemy, they do so 6 inches away, which means that they have to roll at least a 6-inch charge to get into melee. However, that's about a close to an 80% chance, a 75% chance or so, to actually make that charge. So if you have a command reroll in the chamber from the tally man, the chances that this guy fails his charge out of deep strike when he's 6 inches away from a target is really, really, really super low. So these guys have a very reliable charge out of deep strike. So either if your opponent is playing very aggressively and you can contagion them with the Poxwalkers or the Rhino, for example, on round 2, let's say, and then you can dump this unit into a relevant enemy target. I wouldn't send them into 5 Space Marines. They'll dramatically overkill them, and you definitely don't need to put that much work into killing a unit like that. But if you can put them into a vehicle, or you can put them into a heavy infantry unit, these guys will jump in 6 inches away, charge in really reliably, and absolutely eviscerate it. So that's the situation I would be looking for there. If your opponent's playing cagey and trying not to engage with your big bricks, because one of the downsides of Death Guard is that their threat ranges tend to be very easy to play around. Basically, all they're doing is just moving forward up the battlefield and then like shooting within mostly 12 inches is kind of where they want to engage. You can use Rapid Ingress to drop this guy, for example, behind line of sight blocking terrain, and then you can move them there 5 inches and charge with them. So they can use that to get around screens as well. Not to mention that these guys also have those plague spewers, just like the plague burst, the plague spitter gauntlets, like the Lord of Virulences have. While they don't have wound rerolls, they're still going to be pretty good at clearing out infantry. Now, with that, we're going to move on to larger game sizes in the Strike Force game mode. Now, Strike Force is a 2,000 point game mode, so it represents a doubling in the size of the army, so we are adding a bunch of stuff here. Although, as you'll see, a lot of the stuff is just going to be kind of iterations on what we've already added into the Incursion list. Now, first off, we've added another unit of Death Shroud Terminators with the Lord of Contagion. These guys are great. They have great synergy with the detachment, so we're going to double down on those units. And those Death Shroud Terminators are going to see play in most of your detachments, so getting additional of them is going to be useful, basically regardless of the detachment that you're playing in. In addition to that, we're also going to add a bunch more Plague Marines. The Plague Marines, as I mentioned before, come in packs of 7, but they can be taken in units of up to 10. So you can get 2 additional sets of 7 to build out another 14. You get 1 extra dude lying around for conversions or to turn into a character or something, but that will also then give you the ability to run 2 units of 10 Plague Marines with characters. Now, I've added a Malignant Plaguecaster to the 2nd unit of Plague Marines. We already have the Biologist Putrefier and Plaguecaster combo for the 1st unit. However, we don't have the Biologist Putrefier for the 2nd unit, so they're going to lack that lethal hit, but we can still use the enhanced critical effect that we get from the stratagem in order to buff these guys. So we're able to get both of these units on mostly full power at the same time. And our rhinos, we've added an additional rhino as well. The rhinos also add another layer of fire support to that. You can also use the rhinos to trigger contagion on people. So one thing that you should always be ready to do is push those rhinos really far forward, disembark your marines, then move the rhino up or advance the rhino up in order to get contagion on enemies, to then debuff them for the rest of your army to attack, whether that's the Dash Rat Terminators going close by, or you're reducing their save characteristic for your shooting, or their toughness characteristic. Now, on top of that, we've also added some additional Poxwalkers for some utility and screening. And last but certainly not least, a bunch of vehicles. Now, the first is a Myphitic Blight Hauler. These little guys are relatively efficient, and they're very good at knocking down opposing vehicles. So this allows you to have a relatively fast, especially by Death Guard standards, unit that can push out by itself, can skirmish with enemy vehicles, and can potentially either apply your contagion effects, or also, you can use them to maneuver or to advance up the table to get contagion auras onto people. Now, you could do a similar thing with these fetid bloat drones. We have 3 bloat drones, and these guys are equipped with heavy blight launchers. That gives them a separate datasheet. There are 2 separate datasheets for fetid bloat drones, so if you wanted to, take up to 6 potentially. But the heavy blight launcher profile is what we're going to be focusing on today, because that gives you some really good long-range shooting. Most of the shooting we've talked about for this army so far is relatively short range. Things like the Plague Marines want to attack you from within 12 inches or so. However, the fetid bloat drones can shoot from 36 inches away. They have a high strength, pretty high AP multi-damage blast weapon, which has additional synergy with the Lord of Virulence. The Lord of Virulence grants full hit rerolls to blast weapons in specific, so having this guy be able to deep strike, gain line of sight to a target that you can then line up all of the fetid bloat drones on allows you to potentially just knock that thing out right off the bat. Now, the other benefit that we have of the bloat drones is that the kit tends to be relatively flexible. It's another relatively fast, light vehicle for Death Guard, which is something that the faction does really well. They love these little 100 to 120 point vehicle profiles that they can kind of spam around the battlefield. You can assemble this in such a way that you could build multiple different bloat drone profiles with it. So they can also take things like Plague Spitters for a torrent weapon. They can also have a melee profile, and all of those are very viable if you're switching between different detachments. So either magnetizing these guys or assembling them so that you can take the weapons on and off are both going to be pretty useful for these little things, and that gives you more flexibility as you are constructing your army into future compositions. Now, playing the Strike Force army is going to be very similar to playing the Incursion army that we just discussed, with the added benefit that the fetid bloat drones and all of these light vehicles add a pretty dynamic dimension to the army that we didn't have in the smaller game size. The big benefit that these things have is that they're independently able to move out and either score secondaries, compete for enemies on objectives, or force your opponent to move out to trade with them, which gives you a piece that you can start a peace trade game with that isn't as expensive as, for example, Plague Marines inside a Rhino. So using these guys independently is going to be very important. And another benefit that we have of these little circular models essentially is that they're very easy to hide in funny places. We can put them in places that are relatively far forward. We can even potentially put them behind sort of walls and line of sight blockers in a very aggressive position, somewhere like this if we were to move out on the first turn. Then allow them to either peek out and kill enemies that are trying to push for the objectives, or push for the objectives and score themselves. And they're difficult enough to kill that your opponent isn't going to be able to deal with them super effectively, right off the bat. So they're going to have to commit something really impactful to them, which you're then going to be able to kill with your Plague Marines or your Death Shroud Terminators. If your opponent doesn't deal with them, they're also a good outlet for applying the contagion auras to enemies to then allow you to do things like deep strike your Death Shroud Terminators close to them. Now, if they do have the opportunity to do so, and in some cases, you may actually have good terrain, good enough for the Lord of Virulence here to deploy on the battlefield and just run out and apply his bonus to people. But in other situations, if you have a target that you want to knock out that's far enough away that it's not in contagion range, you can drop the Lord of Virulence into a position where it can see that target and then line up all of the Fetid Bloat drones. They're relatively fast. They have a relatively long range, so you can line them up so they can all see the same target that he can see. They get the hit rerolls. They have lethal hits, and they can start to sort of laser beam down damage onto enemies in the way that we discussed previously with the Plague Marines, but in this case we can do it from a little bit longer, a little bit farther away. And then from there, we're basically just able to push our Plague Marine coverage over a greater area of the battlefield. We're able to threaten more objectives with the Plague Marines, thanks to the second Rhino and the second kind of Plague Marine wombo combo that we have out of these units here. Now again, with the Poxwalkers, I would try to use them to sort of instigate these fights, put them in positions where they're either move blocking enemies or they're taking objectives and things, and forces your opponent to come out to attack them, which then allows you to counterattack with the Plague Marines is the ideal use case for them. You could potentially put them in front of your opponent's line, for example, like I talked about previously, but there's a non-zero chance that your opponent will go first and they will just die. So keeping them safe for the potential that they score in the future, I think is going to be more valuable for you. And then from there, we're going to be using our Death Shroud Terminators and other units in basically the same way that we discussed them in Incursion games, where you can either threaten to rapid ingress to bring them into melee, or just deep strike them 6 inches away from enemies that are near you, and then just charge normally. So we have 2 of those big, powerful melee beat sticks if we want them. And that, in a nutshell, is this Champions of Contagion list being played in a Strike Force game mode. As I mentioned at the very top, it's relatively slow. It's not the fastest army in the world, and it's kind of predictable and relatively passive, but the amount of damage you can get out of this army is incredible. And Death Guard definitely make up for their kind of tepid maneuverability with their ability to basically just kill anything in the game, especially if it gets close to them. Now, moving on into the future, a benefit, as I've mentioned several times, of this faction is that it does expand very well into different playstyles, and most of the units that we talked about in this army are going to be played in multiple detachments. If you want to push your Plague Marines and your Terminators to insane levels, you can swap to a detachment like Virulent Vectorium. That gives you very powerful enhancements to push your melee profiles through the roof. It has similar stratagems to Champions of Contagion, so it's a very easy fit. And you also can play units like Demon Princes and even the Primarch Mortarion himself in that detachment, and they are very effective. On top of that, if you want to play the Bloat Drones, the Mephitic Blight Haulers, and the vehicle-focused stuff, you can swap over to Mortarion's Hammer. That also has additional synergy with Affliction payoffs, because it's able to afflict enemies at range rather than forcing you to be close to them in order to get things like your close deep strikes with your Death Shroud Terminators, which is really cool. Or if you want to just take a bunch of Terminators and you want to take things like Blight Lord Terminators potentially, or more Death Shroud Terminators, you could play a detachment like Flyblown Host, which can buff their survivability as well. So there's tons of options for where to expand this army into other detachments as you gain more experience and you progress in your Death Guard career. But that is my recommendation for a baseline. And with that, that is a breakdown of getting started with Death Guard. Let me know down in the comment section what your starting army with Death Guard is going to look like, and if you want to see another faction on this series. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video, and thanks to everyone who supports Tactical Tortoise. Big thanks to the Friendly Fire team for sponsoring the video, as well as everyone over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.